Okay, I'm going to read verses 12 through 20. When Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." The Pharisees challenged him, "Here you are, appearing as your own witness. Your testimony is not valid." And Jesus answered, "Even if I testify on my own behalf, my testimony is valid. For I know where I came from and where I am going, but you have no idea where I come from or where I am going. You judge by human standards. I pass judgment on no one. But if I do judge, my decisions are true, because I am not alone. I stand with the Father who sent me. In your own law it's written that the testimony of two witnesses is true. I am one who testifies for myself. My other witness is the Father who sent me." Then they asked him, "Where's your Father?" "You do not know me or my Father," Jesus replied. "If you knew me, you would know my Father also." He spoke these words while teaching in the temple courts, near the place where the offerings were put. Yet no one seized him because his hour had not yet come. I'm going to concentrate on just verse 12, where Jesus makes this I am claim. "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." And here in these words, we find a metaphor, we find a claim, and then we find a call. And I'd like to work through each of those. First, the metaphor. I am the light of the world. The metaphor is light of the world. And it's really a staggering and astonishing image and metaphor if you sit back and think about what light is and how it provides life. Light. Probably you realize this already, that all of life, every living thing depends on light. Without light, there is no life. So, you can just think about it this way. What if there was no light? What if all of a sudden, tomorrow the sun didn't rise, or we got into some kind of, there's these crazy scenarios like nuclear winters where all of a sudden the sun is just blotted out, no light pierces through. What would happen to life? Probably you've done this before, right? You've had a house plant, and you put it in a dark room, and you didn't. What happened to the plant? Before too long at all, the plant, it dies. Life is totally dependent upon life. And now just suppose, the sun didn't rise, a nuclear winter, the sun couldn't pierce through, there was no light. What would happen to all the plants in this world? They'd all die. What would happen to our food chain then? It'd be destroyed. What would happen to us? In order for life to exist, light must be there. That's part of this image, part of this metaphor. It's a really rich image, really rich metaphor. Not only is it about life, but also about truth. Light reveals the truth, how things really are. So suppose right now I decided to go for a walk, but everything was pitch dark. There was nothing in front of me. So I walk outside and I'm walking along, and I wouldn't be walking as confidently because I can't see what's in front of me. Maybe there's a tree right here. And, there's two ways to find out about that tree. One is in the dark, I just stumble into it, right? I probably hurt myself, and then I can feel the tree and find out where it is. Or the other way is, the light is on. And when the light's on, the truth is revealed. You understand what I'm saying? I see the tree. I see how far it is from me. I see the size of it. And therefore, when I'm walking along, I can avoid it. I'm certain this must have happened to you, that you were staying in some place that you weren't familiar. Maybe it was a hotel room or something, and it was dark, and you got up in the middle of the night, and you tried to make your way to the bathroom or something, and what? You ran into the desk, or you stubbed your toe. Why? Because it was dark. Light reveals how things really are. Light's not only life, but truth. Light brings life. Light brings truth. A third thing, I'll just, in a broad umbrella category, beauty and joy. So imagine, you're out, you're looking at some beautiful landscape. What makes that beauty? It's just light, right? The light, it interacts with different objects in different ways, and the light refracts and it bends back and is reflected into our retina, and we behold the beauty. What is that beauty other than just the light itself that we see? Light brings beauty. If everything was darkness, what beauty would there be in this world? And even joy. I mean, here we all live in Florida. We're here in the Sunshine State. Some of you have lived other places before, right? I grew up in Montana and Washington States, but there was about 5 years of my life where we moved to Western Michigan. Anyone lived in Western Michigan before? A few of you? Here's what happens. Lake Michigan is there, and for whatever reason, I mean, as the winter goes on, it is day after day after day of clouds. Have any of you lived in an environment like that before? If you have, it's wintertime. What are the people like during that time of year? Grumpy. I mean, some of you moved here to leave that. Like, I don't even have words to describe how I felt. Just. Light brings joy. I mean, in any place where there's light and beauty, joy naturally results. You take away the light, you take away the joy. That's the metaphor. I mean, staggering image, staggering metaphor. All right, now the claim. Jesus says, I am the light of the world. When Jesus says, I am the light of the world, I know, because of the way you're looking at me right now, that it's not striking you the way it struck the original audience. This was a staggering claim that Jesus made, and it was so bold, so even offensive at the time, that when John writes this, he himself is surprised that someone didn't walk right up to Jesus and choke him. I mean, look what it says in verse 20. It says, he spoke these words while teaching in the temple courts, near the place where the offerings were put. And then it says, yet no one seized him, because his hour had not yet come. I mean, he's like, man, can you believe this? I mean, he stood up and he said, I am the light right in front of everyone. And, I mean, it's surprising. No one walked up and just grabbed him and tried to kill him. So I'd like to work our way through. What was it that Jesus was claiming when he said, I am the light of the world? Why was it so striking? Why was it so bold? Why was it so brash that people, I mean, their inclination would be to kill him? And John is writing this. He's like, I can't believe no one killed him. Why? So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to introduce you to a word. And once I introduce you to this word, I'd like to talk about this word and its history. It's the word Shekinah. By a show of hands, any of you heard, you know what this word is, Shekinah? You've heard it. Do you know what it is? This is a really important biblical concept, and you'll never really understand what Jesus was saying unless I walk you through the history and the meaning of this word and what it's all about. Actually, it's a Hebrew word, and it's such a unique word that it's just no one has been able to come up with an English word that matches it. Oftentimes, it's translated glory cloud or God's glory. Actually, the Hebrew word shekan, which is a verb, means to dwell. It has to do with God dwelling with his people. And by the way, in the Old Testament, probably you're familiar with this idea of the tabernacle or the tent of meeting. You know the tabernacle? The Hebrew word for tabernacle is mishkan, which means place of dwelling. So shekan means to dwell, mishkan means place of dwelling. Shekinah is a noun, and it has to do with the glory of God's dwelling or the glory of his presence. And it actually is featured all throughout the Old Testament. Probably you just never realized it because translators, they don't quite know how to put it into English. But I'd like to walk you through and show you a history of the Shekinah, the glory cloud, the light of God. So here's the first place. Exodus chapter 13. Probably you know this, that God's people were slaves in Egypt. And God called this man Moses, and he met him first at a burning bush. He says, I want you to go to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and I want you to say, let my people go. And Moses, when he went, Pharaoh initially, he resisted, but finally relented, and he finally let the people go, and they left. And this is what it says as they're leaving. It says, by day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. I mean, this is incredible because you probably know this. They were in Egypt, and they wandered out into the wilderness, which was a desert. Now, in a desert, when the sun is overhead, how far do you normally make it? Not very far. Why? The sun is hot. It's foreboding. I mean, very difficult to travel. And you know what God did? He was there in this glory cloud. And it was like in the daytime, it sheltered them so that they could travel. I want you to think about this. It was a protecting cloud that they could travel. The sun didn't hit them directly. But then by night, I mean, we've already talked about what's the problem with trying to navigate in the night. You can't see. You're going to stumble. You're going to fall. But at night, this cloud, it took on the quality of a blazing fire and gave light. And for that reason, the Israelites could both travel in the day and in the night. This was the visible presence of God that was guiding and protecting them. And if you were to open up Exodus 13 and read the story, actually what ends up happening as they go, you might remember this, that Pharaoh, he changed his mind. He thinks to himself, well, what have I done? And he actually sends his chariots and armies to go and capture them again. And the Bible actually says that the cloud went behind them. And on one side of the cloud, it caused so much darkness that the Egyptians couldn't move forward. But on the other side of the cloud caused light so that God's people could continue to move forward. In fact, the cloud, the glory cloud, the Shekinah, was fighting for God's people as they were leaving Egypt. Anyway, finally, they escaped Pharaoh's clutches. They passed through the Red Sea. And shortly after this, you'll remember, God brought them to Mount Sinai, where he appears to them and he speaks to them. And it was at Mount Sinai, actually, God entered into a covenant with them. And he said, okay, I'm your husband, and you're my bride, and you're going to be my people, and I'm going to be your God. And at the time on the Mount Sinai, this is probably what you remember, God actually wrote out the 10 Commandments and says, okay, this is how I want you to live then. In Exodus chapter 19, I just want you to see the words here, the history of the Shekinah, the glory cloud. So it's on the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning and a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. I know that my words are going to fail to describe the Shekinah glory cloud of God. I can't put into words what it must be like to stand at the foot of that mountain and all of a sudden, whoosh, this thick cloud and a trumpet blast. And I mean, the description here is the people are just trembling, they're quaking, they're shaking. There's a mix of fear and awe and majesty at this cloud over the mountain. And it says Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. I mean, even the description here, it's too wonderful. I mean, on the one hand, it's like thick smoke. Thick smoke, at least by my experience, looks dark. But as the description is here, it's blazing with fire. This is the Shekinah glory cloud of God. Probably you know this as well, that God intended to dwell among his people. So while Moses was up on Mount Sinai, he gave some very detailed instructions about building something that was called a tabernacle. God intended to actually dwell among his people and dwell in this tabernacle that was created. He gave these really detailed instructions, and then the Israelites go ahead and build it. And at the end of the book of Exodus, in chapter 40, it says, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting. That's another phrase for tabernacle. The cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and the fire was in the cloud by night in the sight of all the Israelites during all their travels. So for the 40 years that they were traveling through the wilderness, there in the midst of them, at the center, was this tabernacle, and there was this this pillar of cloud that would protect them during the daylight, so they were out there in the wilderness. The sun wouldn't scorch them. They wouldn't, wither up and die. But by night, it would be a pillar of fire bringing light to the entire camp. And the Bible describes whenever this pillar got up and moved, they moved. And God led them and guided them. And the glory of God, the Shekinah glory of God was in their midst. Now, probably if you know the whole story, you realize this, that eventually God brought the people into the promised land. Once they got there and they became established, there was kings that were set up, first Saul and then David. Actually, David had it on his heart. He said, we've got to have a permanent dwelling place for God. He no longer needs to live in a tent. I mean, we're here. And David had this heart, I want to build a temple. God said, no, your son will do it. And actually, that's what Solomon, David's son, set out to do. He built this temple. And there's a description in 1 Kings of the temple being built, and the priests are there in the inner sanctuary getting everything ready, and finally they clear out. Well, I'll just pick up the story from there, 1 Kings 8. When the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. Now, again, words fail here. But apparently this Shekinah glory cloud, it was so majestic, it was so, awe-striking, that the priests, when it fills the temple, they can't even work. I mean, they're filled with terror and majesty and awe, and they can't even perform their service because that Shekinah glory cloud is there. Now, here we are in John first in chapter 8. And Jesus stands up and he says, I am the light of the world. Where is Jesus when he says that? And it says in verse 20, if you still have your Bibles open, you see it there, that Jesus spoke these words while teaching in the temple courts. So he's standing in the temple, and this is really important to the whole claim he makes, I am the light of the world. When did Jesus make this claim? In other words, what time of year was it? What was going on in the temple? And in order to see that, you just have to look at the specific words in verse 12. If you read it very carefully, it says, when Jesus spoke again to the people. Jesus spoke again. You have to ask yourself, well, when did he speak first? In order to answer that question, you have to turn back to chapter 7 to verse 37. And we'll find out where Jesus was and when he was. What was the occasion of him saying this? Verse 37, it says, on the last and greatest day of the festival, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, in this case, let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. So it was the last and greatest day of the festival, and so when Jesus speaks again, it's still the last and greatest day of the festival. And let's just talk about it. This festival was the Feast of Tabernacles. I don't know if you know very much about the Feast of Tabernacles. Actually, this is the way it was in Jerusalem, where the temple was. The Shekinah glory of God was there. And 3 times a year, the Israelites, they left their fields, they left wherever they were, and they came to Jerusalem to just celebrate in the presence of God. The Feast of Tabernacles was considered the greatest of those feasts, and the reason was because it was at the time of the harvest. And it was a celebration of all the ways that God had provided for them. And so I'll just give you some examples of the types of things they celebrated. One of the things they celebrated was just the harvest itself. They would remember that at one point they were wanderers out in the wilderness. They had no fields. They didn't produce crops. And so, now we have a field and it rained this year and we have these crops. And so they'd take these crops and they'd go into Jerusalem and they'd actually wave them before God, celebrating at the Feast of Tabernacles. Look how God's provided. Actually, the name, the Feast of Tabernacles, it's actually given this name because one of the things they did is they actually, when they got to Jerusalem, they built these booths or tents or tabernacles. And, it was just a live and festive atmosphere. Everyone was outside, like living in a tent. And you can just imagine this, hundreds of thousands, maybe even 1 million people gathered together in a city, living in these temporary tent structures, celebrating together how God has provided for them and all the things they've done. That's one of the things they did at the Feast of Tabernacles. Another thing they did, and actually this ties in with chapter 7, they had what was called the water ceremony. And actually what would happen is, in the midst of the Feast of Tabernacles, the priests, they would bring these jugs down to the pool of Siloam, and they would dip into the pool, and they would bring the water, and they'd pour that water out. And they'd remember God's provisions in the wilderness. Of course, if you're in the desert, what do you desperately need? Water, right? And I don't know if you remember this, but God provided water for them in the most miraculous way. Moses struck a rock with his staff, and water, pure drinking water, came gushing out. So they never had a need for water while they were wandering in the desert because it came from this rock. And so that's one of the things they remembered. Hey, God provided for us when we were in the wilderness, and they'd have this elaborate water ceremony. And people, would celebrate, and it was such a moment. There was like a parade around this whole idea of water. There was a third thing that happened. And actually, it was in the temple courts. There were these tall candelabras. Historians tell us that in Jesus' day, there were these tall candelabras. They were 75 feet tall. So I don't know how to, twice the tall of our ceiling, the height. And apparently they had at the top these huge tubs that were overlaid in gold, and inside the tubs was olive oil. And actually historians tell us that they used like the priests' garments that were worn out from the year as wicks. And so, you just think about these huge blazing lamps. And there were 4 of these candelabras, and historians tell us there was 4 of these huge tubs at the top of each one of these 75 feet tall. And historians tell us that when they lit them at night, the entire city of Jerusalem, no matter where you were, was totally lit up with the brightness of these lights. And, okay, why? Why in Jesus' day, at the Feast of Tabernacles, did they light these huge lights? And let me tell you why. It was because they were remembering the Shekinah. You say, well, wait, I thought the Shekinah was there. What happened to it? And now I got to tell you the rest of the history. Here's what happened. God's people built the temple, and God said, you obey me, and you follow after my way, and I'm going to bless you. But if you don't, I'm going to leave. You'll leave. And if you read through the Old Testament, what you'll find is that God's people slowly but surely turned away. God caused foreign armies to come in and invade. And finally the Babylonians came. The Babylonians just destroyed Jerusalem, and they burned the temple down to the ground. Ezekiel was a prophet at that time. And in the book of Ezekiel, he actually details the vision he has of the Shekinah glory of God departing. And he has this vision in chapter 10 of his book where there's these cherubim, mighty angel warriors, and they lift off, and the presence of God lifts off as well. Anyway, I'll just put some of the verses on the screen here. He has this vision where the cloud filled the temple. The court was full of the radiance of the glory of the Lord. I'll just pause there, just another way of describing this Shekinah. The radiance of the glory of the Lord. But then he sees this Shekinah lifting up and heading off east. And at the end of the chapter it says, then the glory of the Lord departed. And this was the absolute lowest moment in the history of the Old Testament. The Shekinah glory that had been with them, that they had celebrated in front of all these years, had literally lifted up and gone. Probably you know this, that eventually there were exiles who returned. First they rebuilt the walls, but then they rebuilt the temple. And one of the real points of awkwardness, shame, embarrassment was that although they rebuilt this temple, and by the way, the temple became even grander. Under Herod the Great, the temple was became a massive structure. Probably some of you have seen pictures of the Western Wailing Wall. Parts of it are still there today. Anyway, the awkwardness or shame came, there's no historical record of this cloud ever coming back. So although it was there in Solomon's time, although it was there in the history of the Old Testament, in the time of Ezekiel, there's this vision of The Shekinah glory of God departing, and although the temple was rebuilt, that Shekinah glory never had returned. So here they were at the Feast of Tabernacles, and one of the things they remembered was the Shekinah glory of God. They had these huge candelabras with lights that lighted up all of Jerusalem, and it's the last and greatest day, which means that at the end of this day, they're going to extinguish those lights. And so although it was a festival of great joy, there was always just mixed emotion and even sadness because these lights would be extinguished again, and the Shekinah glory wasn't there, and so the temple would go dark. It's into that moment that Jesus got up. And by the way, where he is in the temple is right where those candelabras were stationed. I picture him almost leaning against one of them as he speaks loudly. I hear him crying out. He says, "You want the light? You're looking for the Shekinah? I am the light of the world." I mean, now you must understand what it was that Jesus was saying, right? Why it was that people were ready to go up and grab him. And I mean, sometimes people say, well, where does Jesus ever claim to be God? I mean, right here in the temple at the Feast of Tabernacles, standing next to these candelabras, which were meant to represent the Shekinah glory of God, he stood up and he says, "I'm that light." Okay? So, the metaphor, the claim, now the call. Jesus says, "Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but have the light of life." So when Jesus said, "I am the light of the world," what was he saying? He's saying, anyone who wants life, you've got to come to me. I mean, he is the light that gives life to every person. If you want real life, if you want eternal life, you've got to come to him. He is the Shekinah. He is the presence. He is the dwelling of God. He's the place for truth. I mean, he's the one who reveals how things really are. I mean, here we are stumbling around in darkness. If you want to understand what your life is all about, if you want to understand your life's meaning and purpose, if you want to know the truth, Jesus says, "I'm the light. Come to me." But beauty and joy, I'd really like to spend some time talking about that. Because when Jesus stood up and said, "I am the light," I want you to see the language here. He says, "Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life," which is a remarkable and astounding thing to say. He didn't say, "You will see the light of life." He didn't say, "You'll behold the light of life." He says, "You'll have it." As though somehow he's saying, you can be united to that light. What was he talking about? I'd like to show you this verse. It's actually in Exodus chapter 33. It's from Moses. Moses, at one point, he actually turns to God and he says, "Okay, God, now show me your glory." And now that I've talked about the Shekinah cloud of God, this is even more remarkable because Moses had seen it, right? Like when they had left Egypt, there it was leading the way. There it was fighting on their behalf behind them. It was there when they got to Mount Sinai and descended. I mean, I'd like to think that if the glory cloud of God somehow enveloped this place, we'd be like so astounded and beside ourselves that, we might not think we need any more. But Moses, who had seen all that, says, "Okay, that's great, God, but it's not enough." He still wants something more. He wants somehow to see God's glory beyond what he sees as the Shekinah glory of cloud of God. Let me come at it this way. The book of Revelation, chapter 2, verses 26 through 28, there's this tremendous claim. "To the one who's victorious and does my will to the end, I will also give to that one the morning star." There's a sermon that was given by C.S. Lewis called "The Weight of Glory," and he referenced this verse, and what he says there I think is just so profound, I'd like to pass it on. He says, "What in the world are we being promised?" He says, "Don't you know that on any fine morning, if you get up early enough, you can go and see the morning star? What could Jesus possibly be promising? I will give that one the morning star. I mean, it must be something more than just seeing it. In some way, we're being united with it. What could he possibly mean? And beauty. Here, I think it probably goes without saying that every single one of us in here is yearning for beauty. So we want to have a beautiful lover, a beautiful partner. We ourselves want to be beautiful. We want to have a beautiful face, a beautiful body. I mean, that's our own desire. We spend unbelievable amounts of money trying to visit beautiful places. We love beautiful pieces of art. We love beautiful words. We love beautiful stories. You know who knows we love beautiful stories? Hollywood figured that out. They figured out that we would literally empty out our pocketbook to somehow or another just hear or behold or see a beautiful story. I mean, we're just yearning for the beautiful. And C.S. Lewis says, no matter how many stories we hear, no matter how many landscapes we see, it's just never enough. Just like Moses, we've seen it, but we want more. And he says, although we can't quite put words to it, he points out that some of our modern day poets have. He says they don't really know what they're talking about, but yet they do. They say things like this, that the western wind will sweep into our souls and carry it away. And if you're like me, you're like, western wind sweep into souls and carry it away. What is that? Our poets today talk about beauty born of a murmuring sound entering into the human face. Maybe you're like me, beauty born of a murmuring sound entering the human face. Like, what are they writing about? And C.S. Lewis says, that they're writing about something we all really know and want. What C.S. Lewis says, he says it's like we're all standing outside of a door, we don't know where it is, and we just want in. It's not enough to see the morning star. It's not enough to behold beauty. Somehow we want to be united with it. He says that's the deepest yearning of our soul, is to somehow be united with that beauty. But that can't happen, can it? Listen to Jesus' claim. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Not just that you'll see it, not just that you behold it, but somehow that beauty that you're yearning for, as though you're standing outside and knocking on a door that you can't even see. He's saying, if you follow me, if you surrender to me, if you come after me, it's not just that you'll behold beauty, you will have it. You'll have life and light and truth and beauty and joy. You'll possess it. You'll be one with it. The metaphor, the claim, the call. Whoever follows after me. And as I close, here's my hope and prayer. That today, the divine doubler would have been speaking to you. We considered the metaphor, the claim, and the call. It's here on the page, that it wasn't just mere words. That somehow, as you heard Jesus speaking these magnificent claims, as he was saying the things he did, there's a testimony that comes from God himself saying, yeah, you do need that. And this call to surrender, to leave everything else behind to follow after Jesus, that today you hear God speaking and saying, yeah, you must do that. And that's how I'd like to close, saying that Jesus calls each and every one of us to follow after him so that we may possess the light of life. May the divine doubler apply these words to each one of our hearts. Let's pray.